So after drifting through lives and homes and travelling across continents for 3.5 centuries, we're finally going to give the child in this painting a name. Artisan to the gods, the most esteemed craftsman and blacksmith in the history of heaven and earth, the ancient Greeks knew him as Hephaestus, but the Romans called him Vulcan. Welcome back to Vermeer's Child for the final episode of this series. Because of some possible signatures, a painted name and a lot of technical and stylistic overlaps, I've spent most of this series considering whether Vermeer was the artist who painted this small painting. At the end of this episode I'll tell you my conclusion, but before I do there's something else about Vulcan's story and Vermeer's life that seem to intersect. If we imagine that Vulcan in the painting represents Vermeer, could the woman represent the strict Catholic mother of Vermeer's young bride, Catharina? Could she be the woman who would not approve of her daughter marrying the young artist? You see, Vulcan did eventually agree to set his mother free from the bonds of his magic chair, but only after he was allowed to take as his wife the most beautiful woman in all of creation. Her name was Venus, the goddess of love and beauty and sex. The Greeks called her Aphrodite. We don't know which, if any, of the women that Vermeer painted was his wife, but we know that they had 15 children together in their 22 years of marriage. We know that 4 of those children died in infancy. What's interesting to us about his children is that one of them was described by Catharina as having been piteously wounded in a boat explosion, plunging the family into debt to pay for surgeons and medicines. It's been speculated that the injured child was Johannes, their eldest son. Johannes would have only been about 12 years old when his father died. If he was severely injured at about the age of 8 or 10, it would perhaps be another reason for an artist to depict Vulcan, the blighted child who was also a god. So let's have a look at the last part of this painting to see whether this little child could be the disfigured Vulcan and whether he has any possible claim to have been painted by Vermeer. We're going to start looking at the boy from the head downwards, and so I want to start up the very top. But first of all, just let me give you some size orientation. His face, the flesh part of his face, from the chin up to the hairline, is about 21 millimetres. So that's a bit over 3/4 of an inch. It's about 0.8 or 0.9 of an inch, something like that. The hair itself, just from the edge of his hairline, from the black bit of his hair up to the top of his bonnet, or the start of his bonnet, is about 6 millimetres, so that's about 1/4 of an inch, and the depth of the bonnet itself is just slightly more than that by the look of it. So that gives you an idea of the sizes that we're looking at. Now the first thing I want to point out, it's interesting when I look at these things myself, I start to notice things that I haven't seen before. For example, there's a little painted jewel just there, which I hadn't seen. It's just in that crack. You quite often get cracking along the edge of painted objects, and certainly in this painting that's the case. There's also something in the shadows just here I'm not going to worry about, but there is something with a different exposure that might be clarified. But let's just have a look at the painting of the bonnet. That's what I want to look at first of all. You can see through it that there's nothing underneath it. It's been painted straight over the other colour, so the artist has just been completely confident about just plonking this straight on top of his hair, and there could possibly be some underpainting under there, but you virtually can't see it. I can see the wall colour through there, so I'm not sure about that. Now over on the right hand side though, this gets very interesting because first of all, just notice the separation of the brush strokes. As he goes over towards the right, he creates a little bit of shadow by separating his brush strokes. They're just a little bit wider. Exactly how he's done that, I'm not quite sure. And then he just ends this colour, this white, right here. And then we have another white, which is on the right-hand side, which has got green in it. There's actually a bit of something painted there too, I can see now. Just a little object there, I think. Anyway, he's basically made this right-hand side as a completely different white, and it's got green mixed in it up there, or over-painted in green perhaps, and a slightly different colour here, and it goes down into sort of a brown colour down here. Now, I'm not sure whether these things out the side, these are spikes that are actually attached to the bonnet, or whether they're just feature on the wall. I think they're something that's actually attached to the bonnet, so they've got a strange sort of spikes out the side by the look of it. I'm not quite sure what that is. But anyway, let's not get too hung up on that. Now I'm going to show you another painting by Vermeer in which the bonnet details are almost the same. In the little street, this is the woman who's sitting in the doorway, and you can see how free the brush strokes are for a start. But he has two different colours of white. He has this colour, which sits over most of it, and then he has a little bit of pink in the white down here where it's coming down towards her face. But you'll notice in the shadow on the back of her head or bonnet, he's painted green. There's actually a little bit of green under there as well by the look of it. So it's a very similar treatment. This use of green for the shadow areas is a bit unusual in Dutch painting as I understand it of this era and amongst these artists. And I understand that Vermeer was the only one who used green over paint. Now I don't know about underpaint though, so that's obviously one for the experts to have to worry about. But I find the transparency of this as you get to the edges so similar to what we've just been looking at. Sure, it's a different size, it's only tiny, so you've got to look at it as if the brush strokes were a lot smaller instead of being quite as large as they are. We'll be coming back to her again and having a look at her shoulder. And you'll also notice on this that Vermeer doesn't even attempt to paint her face. The flesh part of her face in this painting is about 7 millimetres long, so it's considerably smaller. It's only about I think the woman's face from memory that we looked at on my painting is about 30 millimetres, so it's only about a quarter of it. So if we now look into his hair, and this is very difficult to photograph because it's very dark, but looking from perhaps the left-hand side, you can start to see all these little dots over here of highlights, and they don't seem to have much form at all until you get across and you realise that what they are is they're little jewels hanging down. You can actually see one right in the centre there with little dots, and off the bottom of it is a little black thing with, again, little silver armature, little silver surrounding. And that's what all of these things are. They're actually jewels hanging down in his hair. There's something sticking up in his hair in this part here, and what looks like a large yellow diamond or something in the middle there. And as we move further across his hair, you need to look sort of into the shadows quite a lot, but you can see these little shapes. You can see them, little black stones with silver set everywhere, all across it. And there's objects coming all the way down here. This one comes across and links up to this thing somehow. This is sort of a large silver thing in the middle of his hair, and it seems to have, I don't know, some sort of a ring around it and a clip or something. There's a part of it on the back of it, and the front of it seems to hang down the front of his hair down towards his forehead. So, and you can see stuff hidden in the shadows there. Awfully hard to see, I know, but it's the same thing as we've seen before. There's details painted everywhere. You can see a yellow stone here surrounded by silver, and this silver thing I think kicks up into a shape here. It's a bit hard to get a definition around the edges of it because it's so dark. Running around in a bit of a loop in the centre is this very fine line, and it's actually painted. And it's also got some objects hanging off it. You can see where it's broken as it's gone across the cracks. The cracks have broken it, but it's incredibly fine. You can see by compared to the size of it, compared to the cracks that it's running through. There's a little yellow jewel just hanging off it there. Another one up at the end here. So the fine painting that we saw on the woman's hair is replicated for the boy. So this certainly does represent this child being a god. You see the jewel there, and you can start to see a little bit of metal work with a red dot in it. So I just want to quickly remind you that if we look at the painting at a normal viewing distance, the boy doesn't look all that strange at all. You have a look at just this bit of his hair up here, where you can see a bit of light catching it. That's all it looks like. It's just a bit of light coming through the side of his face, just catching at the top of his brow. And his hair looks completely normal on both sides. But now we go and look at what actually is happening in the painting, and it's quite different. Because if we look up at the top of his head, you can see that his hair seems to stop about here, a little bit there. There's this big green patch on his head. There is that white highlight, and I don't know what happens to his hair down this side. It seems to become a bit brown again, but I'm not sure whether that's his hair or not. And the bonnet seems to go over this area, but there's no real indication of what's going on here. Now, it could be that there's a metal plate or something on this part of his face, because there are some edges, but I can't make it out, to be quite honest, what exactly is going on there. It's certainly a completely different patch from the rest of his hair, and I can't see a reason for it. It's obviously in shadow, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be hair there. I mean, there's hair down here by the look of it. So is this an injury? Is this something where the boy's lost a chunk of his hair? It's not quite clear what's going on there, but anyway, it's just an interesting issue. He's got just green paint. He's got some highlights. Interesting how many colours there are in this little bit of his forehead. You've got a sort of almost a purpley colour here. You've got this very light colour. You've got a different shade again, a different shade again. There's just so many multiple shades of colour and just in this one little area of his face. And yet when you stand back and look at the whole thing, it just blends together and looks completely normal. But up close, it's just an absolute patchwork. Now, we saw that this little silver object on his head had some sort of a piece of metal that came down the front. And I think that does continue, and there are indications. I mean, it's hit and miss here. There's bits missing, but it does seem to come down in some way. It might perhaps go out to the side and then come back again, or it goes straight down. But there's a big jewel hanging right between his eyebrows, and that jewel is suspended on a ring here, which seems to go across to a connector, which is a bit hard to see in this photo, but it's just here, and it runs off to the side of his face. And I think there's one on the other side. But the bottom line is the whole thing in the very centre of his head, what looks like a bit of damage from a distance, is actually a large jewelled object. Now, I think either during the varnishing phase or there's been some previous cleaning, some of this has been swept away because there's disconnects between various pieces of it. I mean, it might be if a whole lot of photos are taken and stacked at different exposures, they might join up a bit better together than what we're seeing here. But I've tried that at various times and not been overly successful. So my feeling is that this did connect over towards his eye over here, and possibly even towards the other eye, but it's just not there. This bit's not there anymore. I've also never been quite able to work out whether these jewels surround a stone here that's of a very similar colour. Don't forget that this artist is all about disguising things. So if he was putting a large stone in, he probably put it in a colour which is just about the same as the face, so that it wouldn't stand out. But then obviously he'd probably point it out to his colleagues or friends or whatever, because in part this looks like it has a few little claws around one side of it, but you can get an idea of it's silver and pearls and little beads and everything. Now, this is only about 2 millimetres wide, and it's about 5 millimetres long, I think. So it's really very small. But you can see it's got pearls, and up this side it's got there's hooks and loops, and the silver runs along, and there's a black stone there and a red stone. And there's another red stone at the top there set in a silver, and another one over here. So this is quite a large, fabulous jewel. And actually it has appeared in past to look a lot smaller to me, so it seems to be expanding out to the right. What I'm doing for this video series is retaking photographs just so that I can prove to myself that I'm not seeing things, that there are actual objects there, because the idea that I've completely lost my marbles is not totally out of order. So I wanted to actually see that something does show up in the middle of his forehead. So I've been retaking every photo that we've seen. It's just been a quick retake. Not going to any great trouble with them. I'll talk a bit about photographs later on. So these are about the worst photographs you'll ever see of this painting. So it's quite a spectacular jewel that he's got in his head. And this is actually one of the first things I noticed about this painting, because I thought it was a piece of damage on his head. Now, while we're here, we may as well look at the left eye, which is his right eye, of course, and it has an object in front of it with silver down there. In other photos, you can actually see silver surrounding it, and there's a little silver rod that comes down, and a sort of it goes back towards his eye there. There seems to be something coming down here as well. This eye isn't shown. It's as if he only has one eye, and in front of it he has a jewel hanging. So there's a lot of reasons to think that this is a depiction of a boy that's been very badly injured. And that's why this face is far more patchy than the woman's face, for example. I'm pretty certain that these patches on his face are scars. And in fact, if we just look on his cheek there, you can see that it's not symmetrical with the other side. It took me a while to work that out, actually. I didn't notice it. I found him to be quite an attractive looking child, and then the more I've looked, the more I realise that, oh no, he's actually been made to have all sorts of problems. And on this side of his face there's a big swelling, and it's actually been emphasised, and the colour's been slightly changed just near his cheek there. And so I think there's, he's showing a big piece of his face is pushed out to one side there. So he is supposed to be quite disfigured, and but quite a friendly face from a distance. But when you get up close to it, you can see that he's suffered quite a lot of damage. I'm not going to try to dig into his face to explain every bit of silver that's on there, because a lot of it I can't make out or understand, but each of those little bits that are catching light seems to have something more going on with it. See all these little shadows of silver that are in here? Some of them have like red stones in the middle. That one there does, that one there does. So there is a lot more going on in this area as well, and I think there's more going on here. It's just not possible for one person to try and work out what's going on with all these bits and pieces. It's obviously the whole painting needs to be mapped, which is unlike all other paintings, which just need to be looked at, but this one actually needs to be mapped to try and work out where all these things are and where they connect to. It's a really huge effort to do it. Now, if you have a look at the other eye's a bit unusual as well. It's got this strange sort of patch of green in front of it, greeny brown in front of it, and it doesn't seem to be completely random though, because it has, like, there's a silver object there, and it has various bits of silver in it, as if it's sort of attached as a shield or something. It's a strange thing. It's even got a little bit of silver up there and some silver here. I don't think it's just been plonked on the top of another object, because you can see this bottom one is really clearly defined and sticking out of it, and as are some of the others. So, of course, we can't work out what shapes would have been common to people back in the 17th century, but this is a bit of an odd one. It's either missing some pieces, or it's representing something that I certainly can't understand. You can see a little bit of a jewel just in his right eye there, and another little piece there of that, and little indication that something's also hanging on this eye at the top. And you can also start to get actual iris and reflections from the eye itself coming in through the middle. So we'll have a look over on the right hand side. I'll just show you that connector that I was trying to find before for this. So I'm pretty certain in those other photos there are some chains that also come down to the top of this jewel, but see this line here where a crack's occurred, and I think that's been because there's probably a chain. If we look at it closely, we'll probably find a chain next to it. What it does is it comes out to a little object here, which is sort of a solid silver object, and this, I think, then connects over towards his hair. So he's got this thing is suspended sort of from the sides of his face downwards, and I think it's also got some chains or something, little fine chains going up towards the object we saw before. So I'm not going to try and explain everything that I think is in his hair. There's objects everywhere, as always with this. It's another thing just over here. We'll just go down a bit further now and have a look. His nose is not particularly well defined. We'll go and get another photo of his lips and have a look at those. Actually, just before I leave this photo, I think I might have worked out a bit more of what's going on with this. And just when I was looking at it while I was talking there, you can see a little hole just there. And if you look across, there's something going over his eye. So this thing is hanging a bit. And if you have a look at the top of it, just in this here, you can see a little fan shape. So what he does, and he does this all over the painting, is something sits in front of another object and he changes its colour. And so this actually, the top of this is actually a bit more decorative than it appears to be. And again, I suspect that probably suspends from something on the other side as well. So there is a bit more going on there. And this thing here appears to perhaps have some sort of a curved connector on it as well. So maybe this is some sort of a shield or something that sits near his eye. I mean, I don't suppose it's a blacksmith's shield or anything, who knows. But it's still a very odd shape, whichever way you look at it. I just took another couple of quick photos of this area again, just to see if I could get a better image of this little jewel here. You can see they're starting to get a bit of form to it now. This looks like a little sleeve into which there's some sort of a wire rope or something that actually does surround this. And so that little stone there and this silver thing around it, that's probably only about 0.5 millimetre wide. So, and you can see that it's somehow, there's a whole lot of see all these, now you can see quite detailed jewels in the shadow that, again, they're all very similar size, tiny little things, but they all have, I don't want to lose focus on it, you can see that it's sort of ghostly shapes of it. You can see a larger shape that this comes into just here. But somehow all of this stuff connects together, little leaves and things I can see there and chains. So a huge amount of stuff. Now, I mean, this sort of thing, apart from what we've already seen, I mean, it quite clearly shows that this is not a forgery. Whoever painted this is a master painter at the absolute top of their game. In fact, it's the top of anyone's game ever, I suspect. I don't know that there's anyone who's ever painted this level of detail on a painting before. I did feel that this was painted by someone young rather than someone old, because my recollection is that your eyes start to crash, once you get towards your 40s. And so I would have thought that you'd need to have incredibly good eyesight and obviously incredibly steady hands to be able to paint this. Look at that there, you can actually start to see around it now. It actually has some shape to it. I didn't realise that there's this thing's got a chain that comes off it by the look of it, and there's actually a red stone in the side of it. Look at that. And this rod has little links. This thing has links and chains. God knows what going to it. I mean, I just can't conceive of how this has been painted. See, even with reproductions, when you reproduce something these days, you're actually limited by pixel size. And so if this in some way was some incredible, computer print, we'd be starting to see pixels down around these sorts of sizes. So it's quite clearly a painting. But, how anyone has been able to control their brush to produce this is just beyond me. Yeah, so I mean, it's clearly not a forgery. It's a painting that's been painted by an absolute master artist. It's really just a matter of working out who he is and perhaps how old he is. So coming down the boy's face on the left-hand side, I think you can actually see a little bit of something connecting in here. And I just wonder whether he's got like a plate on the outside of his face. It seems to be like a little lump sticking out there. There could be something holding the side of his face. I mean, I imagine that when injuries were treated in the 17th century, there was nothing pretty about the way it looked afterwards. And I wondered whether these things might not be doing a double duty of light for those of us standing at a distance, but when you get up close, whether or not it would be seen as some sort of a bandage, because this little silver object that runs through this piece of what looks like cloth when you get up close. I wonder whether it's being held on. It actually does sort of tie off further up. I don't know what it would tie onto, but although strangely there does seem to be something sticking out of his mouth. It's a bit like a tongue, isn't it? A pointed thing sticking out of his mouth. You can see his teeth just there, and his lips. His lip on that side sort of blurs into his face. On this side it's a bit more defined, a little bit of burgundy colour in the corner of his mouth there. But yeah, he has little teeth that you can see. So at least he hasn't completely lost everything by the look of it. The other thing that's worth pointing out, there is something in his hair on both sides. On this side it connects down via a silver chain, and I'm not 100% clear what it is, but it's something with you can see red in there and some silver around the outside, really finely detailed as always. There's a couple of nice little brackets for you there. A little bit of red stone. So there's some finery going around his hair on that side. And on the other side, it actually looks like they're feathers. It looks like he's wearing a indigenous American headdress of some sort. It seems to be like a toggle there, and some perhaps bird feathers coming down. Vermeer was a great lover of dressing up people in foreign costumes. I wonder if there's any relevance to this. Of course, my theory is that he was trying to draw a god. Perhaps this is his idea of the headdress of a god. You see bits of random silver hanging off the edge there. More bits of silver and decoration here. Some fairly large paint losses. I mean, they're tiny in appearance, but it does worry me. This area towards the centre of the painting is very flexible, and the longer it goes unprotected, the more chance it's going to lose some more pieces of paint. You can see how important each piece is in this painting. It's, I mean, if he lost this chunk here, it'd be absolutely tragic. But any piece is tragic as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, there's some sort of a toggle there, and yeah, they do look like feathers to me. Anyway, we'll keep on going further down the painting. Whether these are meant to be on this side bandages or not, well, there's no doubt that on this side it's green. It's green overpainting, and I think it's just representing, well, I don't know whether it's totally just representing shadow, but it certainly is partially representing shadow. And you can see the way that's been again feathered as it goes towards the edge of his jaw, which just softens it, but also slightly darkens it as this darker brown layer shows through. Let's have a look at the part of his tunic that's on his shoulder. It's white, and I just want to look at the way that that's painted, because it's very distinct, and we just saw it a minute ago. There's actually one white down underneath. Okay, so it seems like a base white. Then on the top of it, he has this other very transparent, still quite a white, and then over on the side here, he's got that pink colour that we saw a minute ago on the woman sitting in the doorway of the house in Delft in the Little Street. Virtually identical colours, identical paint treatment. So let's go back to that again so that you can see what I mean. So let's have a zoom in on this woman. She's a much smaller woman, of course. So the brush strokes will look probably comparatively larger depending on what size brush you use, whether you've gone to a brush that's consistent with the size or not. But you can see the very transparent white on the top, quite a creamy white with these yellow transparent lines between them. Almost looks like varnish or something's fallen into those grooves, doesn't it? And then you've got exactly that pink colour in the pink white on the shoulder there. So, and of course that was the pink white that we saw in her little bonnet. So, and there was a green there, which we don't have on the shoulder here because we're in full sun. So we're looking at someone who's either the ultimate expert who knew that this is exactly how Vermeer painted this and then copied it, or of course the more likely explanation is starting to become the fact that Vermeer actually painted my little painting. Now if we drop down just a little bit further in his collar on his chest, you'll see this little white shape here, and I believe it's a dog, a little ivory or bone dog, slightly transparent. You can see there's little bits of silver through it that probably relate to some sort of an armature or other, because there's a chain at the top here that goes up to his collar. Now, this little chain is absolutely minuscule, and it the chain actually hooks onto a little knob there that appears to have like a lever here. So I don't know whether you pull something to connect it, but it's got like a little catch that's hooked over there as well. I don't know whether you can still see it. It's probably gone a bit blurry now, but I think you get the idea of how detailed it is, and it's probably, I don't know, might be 0.5 millimetre, something like that. It's absolutely minuscule, and even the chain itself has detailing on it. So again, we find more of these really tiny things. And I think just the fact that there's a dog there on the child's chest starts to make this perhaps a bit more of a personal painting. I guess, we are looking at paintings on different levels. We're looking at the mythological scene, and we are looking at just a genre painting. So I guess maybe the dog's just part of the genre painting. But over on the side here, I believe this is a safety pin, because there's something that connects to it across here. But it's got a little ferrule on the top of it, and I think it's got a bit of a red stone in it there. And it's got this zigzaggy thing with a straight side on it. So I think it's a pin through his tunic, probably a safety pin, so that perhaps he doesn't lose this little ornament. So it's someone who's been fastidious about depicting every little aspect. I'm not going to try and go into every detail that's in this painting, but over on the right side of the boy's chest, obviously his left side, I mentioned before that the woman's arm appears to be reaching across something, and I think this is the strap that comes down here that she's reaching across. You can see that there's some sort of a metal connector or toggle or something at the top, and it goes into some sort of a brown, perhaps ropey thing there. I can't see what it's doing, but as you can see pretty clearly that as it comes out of this silver shape, it goes into a fairly broad-looking strap, I suspect. This object is interesting. It looks like a belt buckle, and I think there might be a leather belt or something that it's connected to, which runs up over his shoulder. But when you get in close to it, you can see how fine the detailing is on it. Again, it's absolutely been painted in the most minuscule detail. Now, all across his chest, there's, wherever you see these silver things, you can see one right there, wherever you see these silver things, there's detail going on. And it's everywhere on his chest, so the chest would take a lot of work to try and decode. At times I've seen various objects, chains and bits and pieces, but there's not time to go into them all here. This thing on his chest here, though, appears to be like a large leather horn that sticks out, and I think actually there is a chain that loops around that from memory and goes down towards the basket. Okay, it's not showing up in this image, but that's the thing about this painting. You've got to photograph it in about a whole lot of different exposures and apertures, so that you get sort of clear photos of different aspects of it, because they're quite difficult to see. You can see just at the bottom of the dog there's like a whole lot of silver stuff hanging down, cascading down his chest. Looks like it's hanging from the dog, doesn't it? And you see there's a large part of it there. This is obviously all detailed. It's just a matter of probably cleaning it off and looking at it. Obviously, it's not all going to be there. I think some of it's probably been swept away by a past cleaning or treatment, or perhaps just the varnishing of the painting. But certainly the chest has a lot going on it. As you get further down towards the basket, you see even more detail down here. But you'd have to zoom in and sort of look at each little thing individually. I'm not sure whether that's not a piece of dust, although it certainly does look like a tree type shape. This is obviously painted, whatever that is. Now we better have a look at the boy's hands while we're here. I've never been completely sure about these painted highlights on the top here, because his fingers appear to be, although I would expect there to be a thumb there somewhere, which I can't see. You can see his fingers and fingernails running around just here, and then his little finger just kicks out just here, and comes in around about the bottom there. Difficult to see, but his fingers, I thought, ran straight along the edge of the basket, straight in this way, and I think that's his thumb there. So I don't know whether this is a highlight that someone else has added. It's too hard to tell. It looks old, but it's. I thought it might be worthwhile just doing a quick reality check about what our actual sizes look like. That's my finger, my forefinger, being held as close as I dare to the front of the painting. It's about 17 times bigger than her finger there. That gives you an idea of, and I've got quite small hands. I've got what they these days probably call Trumpian hands. So it gives you an idea of just how small some of these objects are. Just jumping back to the woman's hands that we had a look at yesterday, you can, if you look around just this area here, you'll see a little silver piece that comes down and it scallops this way and then it scallops again. So I think my suspicion that there's another piece of something sticking up here is probably correct, and that this is not part of her hand, and that I think this is her little finger just here, the last one just tucking under at an angle. The next one we can see the nail of. There's one there that you can see the nail of, and the next one wraps around the apple. You can get an idea of the detail of the basket as well, just some of the shading on the basket, some of this sort of fine detailing on it. It seems to have had some shadows painted onto it in a green colour there. And it does have some sort of a metal support bracket that sits underneath it. So this basket has got lots of support for this child. There's all sorts of bits that run up and over his arms, etc. And I think there's something here that chains hook onto in the front of his chest. So it's a more realistic basket in that regard than the one in De Hoog's painting, because De Hoog's just got the boy holding a basket out in front of him, which obviously is not what a vendor would do. It only lasts about 10 minutes, a young boy holding a basket out in front of him. So this basket is actually supported off the tunic, so it's quite different. And you can see a part of it just here. There's a rope that runs from somehow the side of the basket, just under his hand, and there's really quite a nicely painted knot there. And just at his wrist, there's some metal, quite a lot of metal actually. So I think this is part of the mythological part of the painting. We switch back to now, because we seem to have heaps of finely detailed metal going out in a big fan shape there. We've got this thing which has some sort of an end to it and an arc over the top of it, and if you just pick up the shadow of metal running around this way and some running over here, you can go and pick up on the other side a little bit of metal there, something there. So there's a lot to be uncovered over in that part of the painting. But we're about to get to a really interesting part. So we've got the basket, and there's a rope that runs off it, which is beautifully painted. We've seen that a little bit of metal around his wrist there, which is appears part of the mythological story, perhaps more than part of this story. See, the metal doesn't show up hardly at all in this image. I just took another one, but it shows up in the previous one. So you get this problem where things are not consistent just depending on the aperture. I'm not changing the light in this, I'm just changing the aperture. So let's have a look though. The area I want to look at is the side of this jacket, just along here. And we get to see quite a lot of underpainting here. Now, first of all, go back a little bit and you'll see an edge here of quite spiky, feathery looking things coming along the edge of it, just there. And if you go in a bit further and look at the next layer, you see that there's sort of a secondary layer of detail just along the edge here as well. Again, sort of ripply, and runs around his elbow, and some ripply shapes around the elbow here, almost fanning out in a feather type pattern around there. And they're really quite spiky at the wrist as it comes down here. So this jacket has some sort of a featuring on it. You can actually see it when it goes up the arm here a bit as well, if you have a look. If you just pick it up along this edge, you can see little spikes along here. So there's something sort of interesting along the edge of this jacket. Now, I'm not going to try and explain it totally. There's a bit here that I don't understand. If you go to the very bottom of the arch, it goes into a different colour here, and it fans back towards the boy. Now, I did wonder whether or not these were wings at one stage. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but we are talking about a mythological painting. I don't think it is, but it's different from the rest of the arch, and actually you can see even another layer just there. So there's something going on in the bottom of that arch which is worth being explored at some stage. But let's just stick with this texturing down the edge of this jacket. Now, I'll take you back to the little street again. Now, there's the woman in the doorway that we've been taking a look at. But you recall that there's two children playing in the street here, and this interesting paving that changes colour as it goes along, which is quite similar to what is in my painting. These two children don't, at first glance, appear to be particularly detailed. The girl might have a little purse, I think, just hanging next to her dress, beautifully lightly painted. But the boy's a bit deceptive because he is quite detailed, and he's unlike all the other figures in this painting. Actually, he has a lot of detail on him. So we'll just get in a little bit closer and have a look at what the detail is that we're interested in. And the main detail is this sleeve. If you have a look at it, it has ridges running along it. Just go back a little bit so that you see there's little ridges of presumably leather. He's wearing quite a leather sort of a tunic here. And if you have a look a bit further down, we'll go in a little bit, you'll see that he has something tied around his waist here, and what appears to be a round shape here. And it looks like it's probably or possibly a basket sitting on his knee. And it has something that goes around his waist, like a leather apron of some sort, or an apron of some sort. And from memory, it's also got something that goes over his back, perhaps like a strap. Maybe that was my imagination. Anyway, what you can see is there's these ridges running up his sleeve. And I think this is a textured elbow on this jacket. And you can see, sort of shapes coming in and out. You can sort of see this one here sticks out a little bit there. So this has probably been a real child's jacket that Vermeer's copied. Clothes were incredibly expensive back in Vermeer's day, and so it's quite possible that clothes survived a lot more than one generation even. There were a lot of hand-me-downs, and so it's likely that clothing of different sizes was just kept for the next generation or passed down to someone. Certainly, when people died, they came around collecting things for the poorhouses and the orphans, etc. So, But anyway, I want to point out that these look to me like ridges on the elbow of this jacket. And this boy does have some coincidences with the boy in our painting, and I do question whether or not this is a basket sitting on his knee here, perhaps just there, with an apron behind it. Not super easy to tell, but we're going to have a bit more of a look at him in a short time, because we're going to come down and have a look at his feet as well. But I think you'll see that he is differently painted from everybody else. He's actually seems to have quite incredible detail. Now, some of this will be to do with the reproduction of the painting, etc. In this photograph, it'll be details that have been picked up by the camera that perhaps are not quite as strong in the painting. But there do seem to be things in this that actually indicate quite fine detail on the boy. It's interesting you can't see his face. He's got a dark hat on which kicks up at the back. I don't know, I think that's probably his collar. It's got some white on it. But this all just disappears down here into really dark shadow. Now, it would be in shadow on that side, although it's not particularly strong shadow, as you see. The light's coming from in front of the painting and heading back. That's why any shadows they're casting are sort of behind them. So there would be a bit of a shadow, but the boy's face is pretty much obliterated. So I know we can't say that these are the same spikes, but they do look like very similar sorts of a treatment around the edges of this jacket to the jacket that the boy in Vermeer's Little Street is wearing. You have to also consider that this is a very precise painting, so these things have been put here deliberately. They're not sort of accidents or anything. And these spikes along here, and I think this is his proper cuff here. So looking at the bottom part of his tunic, there's a few things to notice. There is a black object that just sits around here, and I'm assuming it's some sort of a support for this basket. You go over to the right, you can see the sun's absolutely ripping into this little corner here, and the light is really just catching the edge of his tunic at the bottom, and we start to see details of silver on there. Now, I'm not going to go through everything that's on this. There's a black section in the middle, which I think could be relating to some sort of metal on the actual tunic. And I'll show you what that would look like. Just notice he's left the underpainting visible in a whole range of areas, particularly on this tunic, both on the top part and the bottom part. Okay, if we just come across to here, you'll start to see a metal object painted here. A bit surprised I haven't seen any religious iconography of any sort. I thought that there might have been some slipped into this, and again this doesn't really look like it, but it's certainly, I can see studs going through into what's either a leather apron or just the leather of the bottom part of the tunic. But you can see finely detailed information there. I don't know how far all that goes down. And you can see some bits of metal here too. Again, I don't know what they relate to. But there's basically the same old thing. There's bits of metal all over. There's metal hidden in the shadows of things. There's it's all the way down, and some larger and some smaller objects. So you can see the bottom of that black object there. So I think that is supposed to be a piece of metal that goes upwards. It might be another support for the basket, perhaps. You can see sort of a large thing there with silver around it and a ivory sort of end to it. Now, as we go down the left-hand side, we start to get a lot more metal starts to appear as well down in this area. So silver all down here, and we'll have a look at where that goes in a minute. But just before we go there, these highlights have always worried me, but when I look at them, they are quite consistent with the other ones. It's sort of this pinkish colour on the edge, and more of a cream colour there, and this is slightly whiter. There's a bit of pink in this one as well. So they look like they are probably original highlights. I thought that maybe someone had just copied de Hoogh's painting and put the highlights that de Hoogh had, thinking that this is just a copy of de Hoogh's, had reversed it and put these highlights on it. But that seems not to be the case. I thought we'd go back to the wrist again and just have a quick look at whatever it is that's on there. And this object that sits just above the rope, it'd be a millimetre at the very most. It's probably way less than a millimetre, just that bit there, the length of it. And you can see it's all textured. And so the painting doesn't just stop at this micro level, it seems to go on further. If you have a look, there's something coming out of it there, just sitting there. And there's a little, like a stirrup thing there, and a beautifully painted little object in the middle of it there. And the light's been painted around it. It looks absolutely perfect. How you'd get such perfection at this scale is a huge mystery. That little piece comes off it, and it's got something coming off here, another shackle thing coming off here. There's bits all over it. Now, all these linked together somehow. In the shadows here, you can see more silver stuff. So these things are all somehow linking together, and all this stuff is as well. So just mind-blowingly small details in this painting. And unfortunately, we can't work out what all of them are. They're just, or what a lot of them are actually. You can see again, this is just as you go around his wrist. There's just a bit of metal showing there on the edge. Until we get over to, we're still going across his wrist, believe it or not. We get over to the other side, and there's this brighter object. I'll just show that in another image. And the metal seems to just catch a bit of light there. And it's and it's got like a ball on the end of it. You can see little bits of detail all through here and back through there, and yeah, it's just amazing. I'll tell you what I do like though, that's really catches my attention, is just the way the paint looks like toffee. It looks, I assume that this is like a glaze. It's just paper thin painting, and looks like he's mixed a bit of black into the yellow just to drop that colour down, drop the brightness down a bit. It's really just sort of almost edible looking paint, I reckon. Maybe I've been looking at this painting a bit too long. So let's just have a quick look at the bottom area of his tunic. Now, it all looks a bit patchy and as if there's nothing particular going on, but as always there is. On the left hand side where it's catching light, there's all sorts of silver objects painted onto his tunic. And you can see in this corner here, there's objects hanging down. You can look at the feathering of the underpainting there with the green. It's really quite finely painted. And over the top, for some reason, there's bits of silver painted over there too. So there's something else being depicted as well. Now you can see lots of really fine detail all down this area here, coming down. It's all across here. The area, there's some sort of thicker objects there, a bit out of focus at the moment. Where the highlight runs down, you'll notice that just over the top of the highlight, where it catches lots of light, he's actually whacked on a bit of silver as well, and given it even more emphasis. So as you'd expect, there's lots of silver running all around it. I'll just have a look over on the other side and see if we can pick up anything in the tunic here. There's quite a bit of patterning here, and like a large stud there, and that's that little thing that looks a bit like an acorn. It's silver on one end and ivory on the other. It's a bit out of focus there, but this seems to have some meaning in terms of the patterning on the tunic. There's an actual little object there hanging down as well. Don't know what that is. But as this comes down and over onto his leg, you can see that it's also really finely detailed. There's silver embossing on his leg as well. I think this solves our orange problem. I wasn't sure whether this colour was real or not, but when I look at it now, because it's got that little bit of a margin that's been left, even though it does run slightly over the top there, I think this margin is consistent with the way he's painted the rest of the painting, so it's actually his paint and he's just left it short, which is how he seems to paint everything. He leaves it just a little bit of margin, which gives a bit of a silhouette effect, but it also obviously lets him continue painting. You see how free and easy his painting is too. It's really very loose, and then he's incredibly precise. As we go down his leg towards the shoe, you can pick out what appears to be the edges of it's almost like a shin pad in a sports. Exactly what it is, I'm not sure. It's silver decorated again, but it seems like it's in the front of his. It seems like it's in the front of his leg, only in the front. And on the side, there's this white thing. It looks almost like a bone, doesn't it? Down the bottom, it seems to run inside, and it seems to be like a splint or something on the outside of it. So I'm not quite sure what that is. When it gets to the top, you just assume it's a highlight, which it certainly appears to be, but this bottom part of it looks quite different. It looks like it's an object that's been painted next to his leg, which his leg is obviously super thin at that point. And it's got this silver thing on the front of it. So I'm not quite sure what that is. This again might be some indication of some sort of an injury, because that looks like a splint. Now, rickets was a big deal in Holland at about the time that Vermeer was around. I think it was only first described not far from where Vermeer was. So it obviously, children did have a problem, and there would be children presumably with some sort of splint system to help them stand up. But instead, I think we're seeing some sort of indication that this child has been injured again. So on the other leg, I don't know whether we can do it with this photograph because sometimes they lose focus, but you can sort of see a very similar thing, and this is where that shin pad is on the other leg, but on this leg it's sitting, his leg's slightly more angled outwards, and so you just see the very edge of it by the look of it. And because there's shadow on his leg again, he's got this green paint. At the back of his leg, let's have a look at the back of it. I can pick up where the edge of it is again. There seems to be something on the back of his leg. But what is that? It appears not to be his leg, but it's not part of the paving. Again, this little dab of orange sort of stops a bit short there. So I just wonder what that is, whether it ties around his leg or what it does. I don't know what this big black thing in the middle is. It looks like some sort of a stone in a setting or something. Okay, so and this one heads down towards the shoe, and we start to see some jewels, etc. there, and some jewels and decorations on this shoe as well. When we get down to the boy's shoes, we find that they're very unusually shaped. First thing to notice is the tongue on his left shoe. The light has been painted straight across the top of it. It's washing straight over it. I think that little jewel that sits on the outside of it is probably part of the tongue, perhaps. I'm not quite sure why it seems to be over the edge of it. But you can see the artist hasn't hesitated to paint over this. It's the same pink-white colour that we've seen before in his collar, and the same as on the woman in the little street. So I'm pretty confident that this light that's been painted between his feet and going over to the left side there in the doorway has been done by the artist. I'm not quite as confident as some of the other whites that are on that left-hand side. So when we get into the detail of the shoe, though, it's quite remarkable. You've got the usual, silver dots, etc., and that one there seems to be patterned a bit like a flower. But you notice there's a little brass coloured tab of some sort there, like a little shield or something on the front. It's actually got a little connector to it by the look of it. I don't know what this rod is, what that seems to be part of the shoe, but again you can see just how finely painted it all is. And this is obviously some sort of a decoration with this green with the gold around it. It appears in a couple of spots, and it seems to have some silver coming off the bottom of it. So it's the same, there's a black stone there, same silver and decorations that we've seen all throughout this painting. And perhaps people who looked at it weren't able to see it very clearly because they would have had to look through some magnifying lens, so having it in silver perhaps showed up a lot better. You can see that little thing there is painted. That's just obviously a bit of dust on the top, but you can see bits of painting all over this going right down. Everything's painted, detailed right down to the nth degree. But these are still very odd shoes because they have a very strange shape to them. I'll get another photo of them in a minute and show you what I mean. But they seem to come down. It's very hard to work out where they end. They seem to just keep on going. And I think that's where we hit some of the mythological part of this story again. So staying with the left shoe, which is his true right shoe, you can see what I mean, that as we get down to the very bottom of it, there seems to be no end to the shoe. The shoe just continues on and then actually seems to morph into this sandstony type colour. And it appears that the boy is standing on something that look a bit like columns, or not columns of a temple, but rock. So I'll just have a look at that in a minute. But just notice that the shoe goes into this strange point here with this strange yellow knob, which is very odd. Now this is the toe of the shoe here going around, and there's a bit of decoration around further up, but it actually has sort of a toe cap just there. And we'll come back and have a look at what's on that toe cap later, if I can get a decent photo of it. But you notice also on this side of it there's like a yellow flash. So I wonder if these are supposed to be flashes, like lightning, or are they, or is it something that's supporting the boy? So kind of strange things anyway. But you can see lots of huge amount of painted detail as always, lots of objects all over the thing, and beyond doubt that this is painted. It's not just sort of stuff on top of the painting or something that's catching a bit of light. There's no doubt that all these things are painted objects. When we get into some of them, you'll see they've got filigree work on them, etc. So let's have a look at the other shoe. So on the left shoe you can see fine detailing just on his sock or whatever it is there. You can see it all there as well. He's got colour introduced into it. It's not just silver. And there's this object that's in the front of his shoe tucked in. You can actually see a top bridge of it just there, and it actually goes all the way around to the back of his heel, and there's some sort of a bolt just there. And then there's something tucked into the back of his shoe, which looks like some sort of a support, and it's got another one of those decorations on it that seem to have multicolours to them. And you can see a jewel that comes down here with chains and connectors, etc. Another one just here with black little stones in it. So little black stones set in silver. And it comes down further, you've got silver with yellow. So the whole thing, as always, is just completely covered with decoration. I can't see the toe of this shoe as clearly as I can see the other one. It seems to be quite a lot dirtier in that spot. But you see the same sort of thing where it's hard to work out where the shoe ends. And that looks like it should be a heel, but then the whole thing seems to be standing on something. And if you look at the sides here, there's things hanging off the shoe. And I think this is where we get down to the mythology. So whatever's underneath these columns of silver and stone or whatever that are underneath the boy's feet are obviously part of this other story. And maybe there's some mythological reference for them that I'm not aware of. But very interesting shoes anyway. But just going back to this strange knob here, these knobs and this strange V shape. There are shoes in the Little Street that are just vaguely like this, so we'll just have a quick look at those. So we go back to our boy in the Little Street again, and you recall that he's a lot more detailed, I believe, than any of the other people in this, and his shoes interesting as well because they're very strange shoes. So he's got leggings here with a garter around them of some sort, and there's a strap here, it comes down, there's a button on it, and you can see little decorations sitting on the front of this shoe. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a sort of a V shape which is described in this area here, which is not totally unlike what we're seeing in my painting, but more interestingly perhaps at the back of it there's a painted knob there on the back of his shoe, which is really odd, and that would be only about 1 millimetre on this painting as well, so it's really very, very tiny. So he has very fine details. You can actually see a bit of the texturing of the shoe there. So strange enough, Vermeer's painted a lot of detail for this boy, not so much for the other people. So you wonder whether this is a self-portrait, some sort of nostalgic self-portrait of himself playing in the street perhaps when he was a child, or could it be one of his children playing in the street? I don't think so though, because he didn't have a boy of that age when he painted this painting. So it's either another child altogether, or it is some sort of a nostalgic self-portrait. So I think that's about all of the painting that I can explain, and I'm sorry some of it's been in a bit of painstaking detail, but I hope you'll agree that it's an extraordinarily interesting painting. I can't explain what this is on the floor, which is quite frustrating, but I can see really detailed shapes underneath the boy's feet coming down. You can see that this is a column, and it's all, and so is this. So the boy is being supported on something or other. So whether it's an Olympian thing or whether it's an Earth-related support, it's a bit hard to tell in this story. But I can't work out what all of this stuff is down in the foreground, but it does relate in some way, I believe. Just in terms of where the overpaint is and where it isn't, if the artist has painted this bit here and that across there, which I think is the case, you can see that he starts to limit the white brightness of the white light here, and when he comes into this area, it's pretty much disappeared by here. And yet we have all this stuff down in the foreground. My feeling is that though the artist might have put some of this in, perhaps along the edges, I think the majority of it has been added by another hand. And maybe I've been a bit unfair to Inskip. Maybe he didn't do all of it. Maybe he did write his name and someone honestly came over the top and touched up over the top of it. But obviously the painting's had a long life, so a lot of things could have happened, but I'm still suspicious about this whole area. I also think that this artist would have almost certainly shown us somehow how he painted this. It's such a remarkable thing, and it would have been so inventive to have come up with some way of painting these tiny details that I wouldn't have been surprised to see something in the painting showing that. And there are lots of odd shapes that are covered up, pointy sort of shapes that are covered up by whatever's been painted over the top here. So maybe somewhere in there's an answer for us. I'm not quite sure, but it seems, maybe it's wishful thinking. So now we've reached the end of this series. There's still a huge amount of information in this painting that I haven't even touched the surface on. I've shown you everything that could negatively impact, as far as I can see, against the idea that this might be an important painting or a painting that was painted by an important master. I haven't hidden anything from you. The photographs that I've taken have been straight out of camera by and large, about 99% of them. The others, you can see some of them are a little bit darker than others. I've had to darken some up slightly because we're probably looking at something very light in the photograph. but there's nothing, no sharpening or digital manipulation going on with the photographs. So it's pretty much as is. Now, despite spending some considerable time on it, it'd take a lot more years and a lot more research from people who actually know what they're doing to fully get their head around and investigate this painting. So although the fact that I haven't been able to uncover everything about it is to some extent an admission of failure, it also means that there's a hell of a lot that's interesting still left on the table for people who will come along in the future. Now, my main concern with this series was to make sure that the painting is saved. When I bought it, if I had have picked it up for $50 instead of $1,300, I probably would have disregarded it and just kept the frame. I don't know whether I would have discarded it, but if I hadn't had a bit of a premonition that it was an important painting, and if it hadn't have cost me so much, it could have easily been discarded or wound up on Facebook Marketplace or something. So paintings like this can disappear quite easily, and this one's been knocking around the back rooms of the world, it seems, for its whole life, and it's really reached the outer reaches of our civilization, and I think the next port of call for it would have been to drop off the edge. I remember when I was reading about the Salvator Mundi that one of the art critics, I think it was Jerry Saltz, one of the comments that he made was how ridiculous it was that a painting like that would show up in New Orleans. But I think that's probably what does happen to old paintings. If I was looking for old paintings, I'd be looking out in the fringes of the world, because obviously the areas where an artist is well known have been picked over to death, and the areas of high art civilization, for want of a better term, have also been picked over to death. But some of these paintings did travel with well-heeled people, and they travelled to far-flung places, and they're probably still there. So there'll only ever be a small percentage of them ever found in the future, but I've seen some enormously interesting paintings come up at auctions not far from where I live, and although they'd be very hard to say that they're important paintings, they're sufficiently interesting that someone with knowledge might have wanted to investigate them. I've also seen plenty of paintings come up, and I think they're sent to the far-flung areas of the earth to trap people who really don't have much experience with art at all. So there are pros and cons to this theory of mine, but anyway, it's just a theory. But the bottom line is I needed to save this painting and stop it from disappearing. I did attempt to get museums interested in it. Now, it was a really bad timing. We were in the start of a pandemic. I didn't know much about the painting when I first realised it was probably important or interesting, and so I really wasn't able to make much of a case for it. And of course, all of those institutions didn't reply to me. The only one that did reply to me looked at an email photograph and just an iPhone photograph of the painting, and made the declaration that it's just a copy, and that was it. So it does make you wonder if museums don't look closely at the paintings that are put in front of them, how many of these sorts of paintings have been lost over the years just for that reason alone. It's a bit of a worrying thought, to be quite honest. I mean, I know museums are not responsible for looking at privately owned paintings, but the reality is they are responsible, particularly national museums, for the protection of their cultural heritage. So there is an issue with that, it seems to me. Now, where to from here? Well, I've really got to stop and think about it. I don't know. I'll have to send the painting away to be stored, because I think it is important, and I don't want to have it sitting around with me, so I'll have to send it to some foreign place to sit in a dark room somewhere and be out of reach, but at least protected. And that's a pretty high price for this little painting to have to pay, I think. I sort of feel a bit guilty about stopping it from its travels around the world. It seems to have possibly enjoyed all the places it's been, and it's obviously been giving delight to people for quite some time, albeit that they might not have recognised just how interesting it is. So yeah, it's got to go off now to a dark place, and I can afford to do that, but I certainly can't afford to do the research that's required to establish exactly who painted this and when and where it was painted exactly. But of course I've got some suspicions about that, and it's probably worth having a think about who might have painted it. I mean, the painting obviously knows de Hoogh's painting, and because this does appear to be a 17th century painting, chances are it knew de Hoogh's painting personally. Now, the carbon dating suggested that the earliest carbon in the support was from 1666, and so that's the very earliest it could possibly be. But of course, there's a margin of error in that, so it does put it, basically the whole of Vermeer's career is covered by that carbon dating possible scope. So Vermeer's not out of the picture by any means, and the other thing that bears on this, of course, is you'd have to be an expert in Vermeer's technique to have come up with all of the little references that we've found in the painting to date. So I think Vermeer is certainly well and truly in the sights. There's an awful lot that points towards him. And of course, the thing that probably points almost strongest towards him is that if it wasn't him, we're missing an artist somewhere who was even better than him, because whoever's painted this has been extraordinarily fastidious. I know that Dow and the fine painters painted quite extraordinary detail, and it was said that Dow wore 3 pairs of glasses to do his paintings, because obviously he was using them for a magnifying effect. But I'm not sure that you could stack 3 pairs of glasses and achieve the magnification that you would need to paint this. I think that's highly unlikely that you could see objects that are as small as this. So something much stronger was used to paint this. Not strong by our standards, but strong by their standards, and certainly low-powered microscopes were available. But whether anyone could work out how to paint underneath is a major challenge, of course. As to when it was painted, playing devil's advocate, if we were to say it was Vermeer that painted this, after the thunderclap explosion, Delft would have been full of the walking wounded. When I was a kid growing up, I just took it for granted that lots of men had, one arm or one leg, and it didn't occur to me until, decades later that these were all the survivors of the Second World War that were still, back in the workforce and back having jobs in the late 50s and early 60s. When I was a kid knocking around around the city, you'd see a lot of guys with one leg and one arm, and the sleeve of their jacket tucked in. I just thought that was just a normal thing. It was quite common for people to lose their arms and legs. But those, of course, were the effects of a brutal war, and Delft, after the thunderclap explosion, would have been full of exactly the same sort of situation, where you would have had a lot of people who had lost arms and legs and been severely disabled. We also had rickets at that time, which I've mentioned, which would have made a lot of children lame through lack of vitamin D. And of course, the other possibility is that Vermeer's own child in some way influenced this painting, but that would then make it a much later painting, something into the late 1660s to early 1670s. One of the problems with that is that I've always thought that the perspective on this was so rudimentary that it was done by someone with no experience or very little experience of perspective, someone who hadn't handled perspective well. And that's what I mentioned back in that earlier episode when we looked at perspective. But of course, one of the things I was forgetting is that someone's overpainted the left-hand side of this painting, and it could be that the correct perspective has been painted out by that person. Perhaps the perspective was there, but it's been painted out. So if that was the case, of course, this could be a much later painting and still be a Vermeer. Anyway, regardless of all that, I think it's an important painting, and it's very difficult to see that a painting that is so innovative, that combines both a genre and mythological story into the same painting at the same time, is not an important painting. So I think this is something that does deserve to be considered, but I can't make experts look at it. I guess at some stage I'll have to decide what I'm going to do with it, but at least if I go under a bus, it hopefully will be saved, because anyone who's watched this little series will say, hang on a minute, I know that painting, and that's all I was setting out to do at this point in time. There is one thing we could think about in this at this point, is that we haven't actually given the painting a name yet. If it's a Vermeer painting, there is a painting that actually is missing and fits the bill, and there are a couple of paintings in the Decius auction. One was the little street, and there's another painting of a house or houses missing. And it wouldn't be unusual for a painting that has a courtyard and a building in the back to be called a painting of a house, particularly, well, from a room as well. So this could very well, if it was a Vermeer painting, be the painting missing from the Decius auction, and particularly given that label I found on the back, which has a name which looks very like Decius to me, but obviously experts would have to look at that. So if that's the case, then it would have that rather dull name of, a house standing in Delft, which seems a little less inspiring than it could be. I suppose if I had my choice, I'd like to call it Vermeer's Child, because it sums up the painting more than anything if it was a Vermeer, but it'd be a very odd name for the painting. Anyway, that is something for the future, if this painting is shown to be an important painting. Now, there are a couple of things that I'd like to finish off on. The boy's shoe has a toe cap on it, and I'll just go and take another photo of it, but there's some objects on this toe cap. I can't make out all of them, but one of them seems to be winged like an angel, and I'll just show you that now. But there's something else about the painting that also personalises it to me, and that's when I was looking very closely at his right eye, and I was thinking about whether or not this was a man painting his own son. And as I zoomed further and further into his right eye, I could see a reflection. So I looked closer and closer at the reflection, and it's actually a double reflection, and in both sides of that reflection you can see what appears to be a human figure raising his arm to paint. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but I think it's a fitting way to end this little story. It seems to me to be very poignant that a man would paint perhaps his own injured child and paint himself reflected in the child's eye. Anyway, thanks very much for watching this series. I hope you recalled, if you ever see this painting sticking out of a skip bin or on Facebook Marketplace or something. And if there is any major development in the painting in the future, then I'll be sure to come back and let you all know. Thanks very much for the time you've taken.